Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome a new voice this week. This is Cassandra Shand. She is a Young Voices contributor, also a PhD candidate at Cambridge, like the Cambridge. Wow. Cassandra, so good to meet you.
No, thank you so much, Brian, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Okay, take just a moment. Since a lot of our listeners are meeting you for the first time, tell us just a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So currently I focus on business strategy and policy strategy optimization at Cambridge, kind of like toolkits and modeling. I'm in the policy and entrepreneurship space. So that confluence of both is kind of my bread and butter. Very into the innovation space. I'm a kind of a big believer in innovation is the solution to pretty much everything. So that's my perspective. Also love foreign policy, though, so very happy to touch on both.
Okay, so we're going to talk today about where the lines of innovation and foreign policy may actually be crossing, and that is AI. And in particular, you had mentioned that, the G7 summit, is it over now? I know it was going on, but I haven't seen I haven't seen a ton of media coverage of the G7 summit that was taking place in Hiroshima, but I'm looking at an article you wrote about where that summit is actually a really great opportunity to tackle AI regulation. So where do we begin? AI is now kind of it's a matter of foreign policy, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, it's I think I put it in my article, but the genie's out of the bottle. There's no way to put it back in. We have a new technology that most countries are ill-equipped to regulate. Our country is ill-equipped to regulate, and it's not like a nuclear weapon. It's a technology that some guy can further develop on his couch through open source, or you can be in a major tech company and you're competing with other big tech companies. You have multiple layers of competition. You're also competing with other countries like the US, like we're competing with China indirectly in kind of an AI arms race is kind of how I like to put it. But you're absolutely right about the G7. It's kind of being overshadowed by other pressing geopolitical matters. We had Ukraine, Zelensky was there. With the F6, there's a new F-16 deal that's being brokered, and South Korea, Japan have reopened discussions, which has also been a major talking point during the G7. But AI is definitely kind of establishing a more refined AI framework is in the best interest of internationally of all global actors, and so I think the G7 is a great opportunity to discuss it.
Okay. And you mentioned in your article that one of the reasons why this is a very good time for them to be discussing it is because this is rapid innovation. In fact, it's so rapid, seriously, I lose my breath trying to just, stay up to, well, okay, what's happening next? It seems like it came on the scene in earnest within just the last couple of years, really. I've started to see it or hear about it on a daily basis. Talk to me about some of the changes that are coming about and what you see directly ahead that makes AI a very, serious matter that needs some serious consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of saw this new large language model, ChatGPT. It hit the scene in December. Since then, it has radically changed a lot of different industries. Most recently, the education tech industry has been hit pretty hard. I think it's the first casualty. This technology has a lot of spillover effects in other aspects of the economy and other aspects of the job market that we fully aren't even comprehending yet. And I think that's one of the things that kind of is a bit unnerving. We also don't know how powerful these newly trained models are going to be. And that kind of creates a level of uncertainty that I think a lot of countries should be very weary about. At the same time, it's kind of rare to see a situation where the industry themselves, or the AI industry itself, is putting a pause on future training of models, which kind of that's really concerning in itself. The fact that the industry is self-regulating and we don't have an adequate policy framework or policy mechanism to regulate it accordingly. I think that should definitely be an area of concern for most countries and most civilians.
Something you mentioned in your article is that the G7 should be looking at maybe a codified, widely adopted agreement or treaty that would set some rules prohibiting dangerous AI development. And I've tried to look at the positive side of AI as much as possible. I made the mistake of watching one of the Terminator movies a couple of weeks ago and was kind of like, oh no, here it comes. But what is the dangerous side of AI development? I'm not necessarily looking at a Terminator scenario, but I understand there are some very real concerns about where it could be taken.
Well, honestly, the Terminator scenario is, I mean, I think it used to be far-fetched, but I think for most people that are very weary about AI, it's very relevant to them today. I think in the defense space, I think that, I mean, already before ChatGPT was launched, there was a big shift towards AI and using AI in the battlefield. That is a concern. There's also a concern about training AI models to the point where they kind of match human intellect. That I don't think humanity is prepared for kind of what comes next, or I don't think anyone really knows like what happens then. So there are these really big pressing questions about kind of the safety of AI. And that kind of like leads me to something that I think should be considered as like kind of a regulatory component. I think that all AI companies should have some sort of like AI safety, AI philosophy kind of. This is actually kind of a cool opportunity for social scientists and for people in the philosophy space to kind of get involved and start discussing AI ethics, AI safety in these AI development spaces, because I think without that, we could get kind of into a weird, sketchy area. And we just don't really know what's next.
This makes me think of the original Jurassic Park movie where Jeff Goldblum's character talks about they were so busy trying to see if it could be done that they didn't think about whether or not they should be doing it. And it sounds like kind of a similar quandary, may be appearing here. Talk to me about the AI race with China and the U.S. Is this like an arms race, or is that putting it in too stark of terms?
I think an arms race is perfectly adequate. I think that whatever country has the superior AI model is going to be on top. It's difficult. I mean, China is pretty secretive about kind of like their training on their own models, whatever those might be. So it's difficult to kind of assess kind of their level of AI competency, but yeah, just because like purely defense applications, that's concerning in itself. And then also kind of the dual use applications of AI. The fact that you could have a commercially applied AI technology also kind of adopt its own defense use cases in different situations. That blurs the lines between kind of what is safe and what isn't. And it definitely it increases the importance of having a robust AI sector in each country. And so I definitely anticipate kind of a more arms race situation, which we don't want. And that's why, and I don't think it's in the US or China's best interest to engage in AI arms race. And so I think that's why we should move towards establishing an international framework to kind of regulate the growth of AI, especially risky AI. I mean, like at this point, it's already out of the bottle. But I think it's a matter of kind of assessing how risky developing in certain kind of verticals is, and just kind of making a judgment call accordingly. So, which is difficult.
Cassandra, this is going to be kind of a weird question, but I'm naturally a little bit suspicious of governments. I know that when they're doing what they should be doing, they can be a great blessing. When they start to slip, beyond what their limits are supposed to be or into some gray areas, it can be a real problem. Can we trust government to regulate AI, or is this something that would be more of a collaborative effort between perhaps some regulatory agencies and the private sector? I mean,
I think regulation should be pursued only insofar as to encourage innovation, but safe innovation. It's like this is kind of a false comparison, but it'd be like, should a private company have a nuclear bomb? That's kind of like that to me is kind of like how I view it. That being said, we do want to encourage innovation in the AI space. We absolutely do. I personally would prefer less government intervention, but at the same time, it is kind of nerve-wracking seeing a few huge like hegemonic companies. Honestly, that's what'll happen. You have this kind of like supranational AI company, which is good or bad. I guess the concerning part is if that escalates with China or with other countries that are interested in kind of like competing on the in the AI space, and that's when you kind of get, in my opinion, like a very clear race to the bottom. And I think regulation and cooperation, especially with other countries, kind of working together and making sure in mutual interest that something like that doesn't happen. That's the best case scenario. That being said, like we do want AI development. Like I am as close to permissionless innovation. That's kind of like my mindset as you possibly can get. But I think we have to be safe and wise about it. And I think that adopting some sort of risk-based framework that encourages innovation while limiting some of the clearly adverse risks of AI is the right way to go.
All right, we're talking with Cassandra Shand. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. She's also a Young Voices Innovation Fellow. Cassandra, where can people follow you on social media?
You can follow me at Twitter at Cassandra Shand.
Very good. I'm going to be watching this subject with great interest now. I appreciate you having this conversation.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Once again, we welcome you back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices, and we are visiting now with Emily Schroen. She is a Young Voices contributor, and Emily, you are also part of a global nonprofit humanitarian innovation group. Tell us just a little bit about what you do, and then we have a very specific topic that we're going to discuss.
Sure. Yeah. So the Humanitarian Innovation Group is the name of our organization. I'm fortunate to be one of the co-founders of the organization. We're formerly known as Americans for Ukraine. It's a group that started out as a way of raising awareness, raising funds, and raising international economic and intellectual cooperation to support Ukrainian refugees, primarily living out of a refugee center in Warsaw, Poland, that we continue to support and to help coordinate. And that mission has since evolved more broad into something where we're trying to envision a new innovative way of approaching humanitarian aid and to bring together partners to start something new. We've recently started some projects in Ukraine itself, working with education, working with local government leaders, and things like that. So what started as a simple, well, not simple, but a mission that was straightforward of helping refugees in a refugee center in Warsaw, Poland, has now evolved into something bigger, and it's been an honor to be a part of it.
So let's give this some perspective in terms of when we talk about refugees from Ukraine. What kind of numbers are we looking at?
Well, it's interesting because numbers have gone up and down, and actually, recently we've noticed a dramatic shift in the demographics and how people are moving. There are some days, on the Polish-Ukrainian border where there are more Ukrainians returning to Ukraine than are coming across into Poland. And a lot of that has to do with some people are returning to their homes after their territories have been liberated. Others, their territories have become more stable, or some have also gotten fatigue of trying to live and fit into host countries. So in that sense, the numbers have changed. But at its highest point, there were, some estimates put about 15 million Ukrainians crossing the border into Poland, surrounding countries, and resettling in many other countries. And many of those Ukrainians, I don't know if it's fair to say most, but many will never return to Ukraine. Or many will settle in surrounding countries. But then there's also a good deal that will one day return to Ukraine and help rebuild the country.
So let's talk about one specific Ukrainian refugee, and he found open arms waiting for him in Japan. When I think about the countries that are welcoming these refugees, I was thinking primarily Eastern Europe. But talk to me about Japan, and then let's talk a little bit about this particular refugee.
Sure. Yeah. And the reason I wanted to do this interview with this particular refugee and then others from Japan is that I think, like you, I had this impression that Japan remains this kind of closed, more homogenous society. They don't have a strong history of accepting refugees. Their policy is still quite strict. So to see stories like Alexei, who is the person I was fortunate to interview, and others who are surviving, and even some are thriving in Japan is welcoming. And Japan still doesn't recognize Ukrainians as refugees. They have a special kind of emergency humanitarian provision where they are called evacuees, which has allowed them to have temporary residential status, temporary employment status, things of that nature. But it's important to think that, according to the government, Ukrainians are still not refugees, and the government's intention is for the people living there to be living there temporarily. But yes,
Wow.
that is kind of the circumstance surrounding that.
So what was this? You're going to have to help me with his name. I can get through Oleski, but how do you say his last name?
Actually, I'd have to pull it up myself. It's crazy. I've lived here in Poland for a little while now, but I still struggle with Ukrainian names. And frankly, he never mentioned it to me. Well, we discussed it a little bit. He just goes by Alexei. He's a very honest, forthcoming young man, only 18 years old.
Wow.
Who ended up leaving Ukraine when he's 17. He was part of a territorial defense force before he was, of the legal age in Ukraine. And now, when he was 17, he was able to leave the country more flexibly due to restrictions forbidding adult men from leaving. So they're available for the army. But so he is now currently living in Japan after having left when he was 17, living in Poland briefly, and then on his 18th birthday, getting on a flight to Japan and starting a new life there as a young person.
Wow. I can imagine there would be some pretty big culture shock. I mean, I've not been to Japan. I have been to Europe, but they're very different cultures. Are the Japanese, are they known for being, a welcoming kind of people? I have this impression that perhaps they're a little more insular as a society.
Right. And actually, I had that same impression. That was how I approached this interview with Alexei, was that it must have been so hard. The culture is so different. The language is so different. And the people are different. There aren't as many international people there. That must have been such a challenge to adapt to culturally. And I was surprised, actually, when Alexei told me, no, it wasn't that hard. It felt more natural than you would have expected. The people were very kind and continue to be very kind to him. I think what we've noticed is, at least from Alexei's perspective and from several other, Ukrainians who I've been fortunate to speak with or work with, is that they've been positively welcomed by Japanese society. I think too, noticing the difference, and actually Japanese government has also been largely supportive through some of these emergency humanitarian measures. But the Japanese society responded very strongly to the conflict beginning in Ukraine. They've been very supportive with humanitarian aid. And I think now they've welcomed it's probably around 2,400, maybe a little more,
Wow.
Ukrainian evacuees. And so we're seeing this shift. But Alexei told me the language is the hardest part, but things like the culture were surprisingly easy for him. And that absolutely shocked me.
So what does this say about the prospects for other Ukrainian refugees, whether they end up in Japan or not? Generally, are they finding acceptance, in the world? Are people sympathetic to why they have, fled their home country and willing to allow them in and invite them to be a part of their own society?
Right. Well, and frankly, this has varied significantly by country. But I think overall, compared to, refugees from some other conflicts, maybe who are from Afghanistan or some other Middle East or African countries, we're seeing that Ukrainians are having a bit more of a warm reception. That could be because of the way that the invasion was publicized. There's at least in the West, a pretty, strong general consensus of a positive sentiment toward Ukraine in this conflict. So there's a bit of a different reaction comparing Ukrainian refugees to refugees from other conflicts, but you'll see, and there's still a positive response in Poland. But as Alexei mentioned, and as actually referenced in my article, is there's a bit more of a weariness with having so many foreigners in your country all at once, and we're noticing this with Poland. There's a little bit more of a culture difference of having all of a sudden in Warsaw alone about 1.5 million Ukrainians almost within a series of months. But in Japan, as Alexei referenced, is they're not as familiar with this. And while that could go both ways, in this case, they don't know Ukrainians. They're intrigued. They want to know more. And according to Alexi's experience, this has made them very welcoming. You know, the United States has taken many, many, many Ukrainian refugees. And while they struggle in ways that a lot of other Ukrainians do, or a lot of other refugees do, they've been largely positively received by the public. That doesn't necessarily mean that things like getting a job or employment or integration are easy. But I think in this case, from my personal experience witnessing the difference, is that Ukrainians are fortunate to have a generally positive public image as refugees.
All right. Again, we are talking with Emily Schroen. And Emily, let's once again tell people the name of the group that you work for, the nonprofit that you work for.
Sure. I work with the Humanitarian Innovation Group, formerly known as Americans for Ukraine, and you can find us on www.hig-global.org.
And where can people find you on social media?
Sure. Young Voices has a page with my name. If you just look me up, Emily Schroen, that's the best place to find all of my work. I'm also on Twitter at @mschroen, and on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great place to connect with me as well.
And we are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm happy to welcome Charles Brandt back to the show. Charlie, we've had you on here before, but for people meeting you for the very first time, let's take just a few moments here to have you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Of course. Well, thanks so much for having me back on. My name's Charlie. I'm will be a third-year law student at George Washington come the fall. And I am training to be a lawyer, obviously. I'm interested in free speech and separation of powers.
All right. We've got a doozy of an article to talk about here. And I say doozy in that this one, I like to think I'm okay at thinking outside the box. But this is something I really hadn't considered. The title is Brown v. Board of Education was also about school choice. And I know school choice is a hot button issue right now. Let's set the stage here a little bit. First of all, let's talk about the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And this was a pretty big deal back in the 1950s, was it not?
It absolutely was a big deal. Brown v. Board of Education was decided on May 17th, 1954, and it held essentially that separate but equal, the legal doctrine that had prevailed since the 1890s in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson, was constitutionally untenable. And so it reversed Plessy and held that segregation in public schools in particular was unconstitutional because separate but equal was inherently unequal, that it made Black children feel a sense of inferiority. And the court pointed to sociological evidence with things like the doll test. So children were asked, between a Black doll and a white doll, which was best, essentially, and you had little Black girls tending toward the white doll. So that was the thrust of the case. And as a matter of precedent, that's what it stands for. And I would say that that holding is pretty responsive to the litigation goals of the NAACP, which argued the case. But interestingly, it's not so responsive to the concerns of the Brown family that impelled them to file suit and enlist the NAACP in the first place.
And so where does school choice come into this? Because like I say, I've been watching school choice battles play out all across the country, but it had never really occurred to me to view Brown v. Board of Education from the standpoint of, but how did that affect school choice?
Well, Matt Halverson, the founder of the Rise Up for Students blog, explained in a post several years back at this point, I believe back in 2016, 2017, what made Leola and Oliver Brown angry enough to sue their local school board. It wasn't institutional racism per se, but a quintessential parental concern for their daughter Linda's commute. Going to the all-black school, that of which Mrs. Leola Brown actually attended and enjoyed her experience there, required little Linda to make a pretty dangerous trek across town through a Yale rail yard, and then I believe only then to take a bus to the school. The all-white school, on the other hand, was just 4 blocks away from the family home. I think what a lot of people assume is that what motivated the Brown suit, or this is what I assumed anyhow, was that the all-black school had less resources, that it was perhaps ill-serving Linda. But it wasn't institutional racism in and of itself, but the decision of a self-interested racist school board to deny the Browns essentially parental choice that set the stage for one of the most famous Supreme Court decisions in the history of our country. And the court kind of missed that point. And maybe we can forgive it for doing so, because it was the NAACP with this larger mission of desegregation that argued the case. But we shouldn't forget, especially as the fight for school choice heats up in state houses across the country, from Tallahassee to Indianapolis, that school choice is fundamentally a civil right. And for evidence of that proposition, look no further than Brown v. Board of Education and the basic parental concerns that motivated that case.
Wow. So I got to ask this. I know there are some state legislatures that are actually embracing school choice. It's always a contentious thing, it seems like, but it seems like more and more states have said, yeah, we want this school choice. Is there a likelihood that we could see another Supreme Court case tantamount to Brown v. Board of Education that focuses exclusively on the school choice aspect?
That's a great question. And I think you could have cases where school choice is tangentially relevant. So the Supreme Court has said, for instance, that when it comes to vouchers and the like, school systems, or I guess I should say governments, cannot discriminate against religious schools. So at its core, that is school choice, but the constitutional rights implicated have to do with religion. In that case, not school choice. The issue with school choice in particular being litigated is you would need some kind of federal right to hinge it on, some kind of federal statutory or constitutional right. And though ostensibly you could argue that public education is a privilege or immunity of American citizenship within the sense of the 14th Amendment's Privileges or Immunities Clause, that was essentially written out of the Constitution in the late 1800s in a couple of really poorly reasoned Supreme Court decisions called Slaughterhouse and Cruikshank. So your question's really interesting. I'd certainly love that to be the case, and I think advocates should give it a go. But I would argue using constitutional law in the courts to further school choice initiatives is unlikely to be availing given the current state of judicial precedent.
Okay. Well, I mean, it seems to me, at least on the one hand, there is some pretty serious progress. I don't know the exact number, but it's been more than a handful of states that have actually succeeded in passing some form of school choice. Sadly, my home state of Idaho failed just barely in this last legislative session. But, we're always holding out hope that such a thing will come along. Are there any other issues related to this that you see perhaps being elevated to the kind of status and awareness of school choice, like we see currently?
Well, I think school choice is kind of the issue right now. Looking at the American Federation for Children's website, you can see all of the different places where the school choice drive is currently active. And it lists Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Nevada, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, and Utah. People have said, I think quite rightly, that school choice is the civil rights issue of our time. And I think that's absolutely the case. And nothing made that clearer than the COVID-19 pandemic, which unions and their allies in state and local legislators used as an excuse to keep public schools shuttered for 2+ years. The learning loss is profound. And most of these kids, unfortunately, are never going to make up all of the opportunities and knowledge that that their teachers have essentially given up for them in fealty to their union overlords like Randy Weingarten.
Oh, yeah.
There's really, I think, a drive, and it's quite heated, quite passionate, to disempower unions and to empower parents. And it's rooted fundamentally in liberty, in this notion that parents, not self-interested school boards like the Topeka School Board and Brown v. Board of Education, to not allow these kinds of self-interested unionized institutions with ulterior motives to make this sacrosanct decision for parents as to where their child should go to school. It's a liberty, it's a civil right, and Brown v. Board of Education recognized that, perhaps not in the decision itself, but in the circumstances that led to the decision.
All right. I appreciate your take on this, Charlie. Again, we're talking with Charles Brandt. He's a JD candidate at George Washington University Law School and a writer with Young Voices. And now, from here on out, I'll feel a little pang of appreciation for the Brown family for what they did to help swing the door open on school choice. Charlie, where can people find you and follow you on social media?
You can follow me at Charlie Brandt 44 on Twitter.
Very good. Hey, I hope we get to talk again soon.
I do as well. Thank you so much for having me.
And we are back. This is our fourth and final segment on Moving Forward with Young Voices. I'm very happy to welcome a familiar voice back to the program. Her name is Finesse Moreno-Rivera. And Finesse, you've been on the show before, but for people who are meeting you for the very first time, take just a moment to tell us about who you are and what you do.
Of course, and thank you for having me, Brian. I am a criminal justice data analyst. I've worked for multiple police departments, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and just really looking at criminal justice policy as a whole.
All right, and I'm looking at a wonderful article that you wrote for counterpunch.org about how body-worn cameras don't prevent police violence. And as I was telling you before we went on the air, I probably spend too much time online. So sometimes I wonder if my point of view gets a little bit tilted or slanted by what I see. But sometimes when I see, police acting with, acting out of the bounds of reasonable force, it kind of makes me think that we've got a real problem here. Now, I've heard people say, well, body cams, that records everything. That means they're accountable. There's transparency. Talk to me about why relying on those body cams to solve the problem of excessive force isn't apparently working.
Of course. So, this before I wrote this article, I really started thinking after Tylee Nichols and the body-worn camera footage was released. It makes you think, okay, you're being recorded, your actions are being recorded. So why is this not diverting you from actually using, excessive force? And so after doing a little bit of digging, I realized that there really is no national set of policies or recommendations for the type of technology that's utilized, such as body-worn cameras, although it was touted and first funded during the Obama administration from the Department of Justice. So what we're seeing is that, police departments are really busy. They don't have time to review their body-worn camera footage, their data, to really find out what the aggressors are that lead up to excessive force. As a matter of fact, what I found that police departments are analyzing less than 1% of their body-worn camera footage. So they're unable to really, look at the officers' behavior and then also learn from that through training practices as a result.
Huh. Well, so let me ask you first of all, and I know this is a kind of a subjective question, but Finesse, how big a problem, is police brutality? Obviously, the stuff we see online or the stuff that makes the news represents a fraction of police interactions. Is it safe to say that it's easy to use availability bias to blow it out of proportion, or is there really a big problem that needs some serious reform?
I think this has been an ongoing problem for a number of years. And I think that when people think about police brutality, you're looking at, in excess, whatever the media has decided to show us in order to say, hey, this is really a big problem. But the thing is, I think police brutality can have varying definitions, right? To me, police brutality can be an officer just misusing, their title. It could be an officer pulling you over for no good reason. It could be, to me, police brutality, extends that of just, losing someone's life. I think that it's all encompassing. And so that's why I think that, the media at some points, yes, they do say, they may, over exaggerate when it comes to the numbers of, police who are using excessive force. But again, my definition to police brutality definitely exceeds that of people who are losing their lives. I think that it just comes down to officers who are, just misrepresenting and misusing their badge.
Okay. Was there any net benefit from body-worn cameras? I know you mentioned in your article it doesn't prevent police violence, but has it had some of the intended effect of creating greater transparency or at least awareness that there will be accountability for officer actions?
I really do think so, because what we're seeing is that it's definitely highlighting some systematic issues across the country within police departments, such as officers who are, planting evidence against incriminating innocent people. They're thinking that their body-worn camera is off, but it turns out their partner's isn't, and so they've been caught carrying out illegal acts of personal gain. But then also what we're starting to see, too, whenever you see officers who are taken to trial or to court for their actions, they're starting to utilize body-worn cameras within the courtroom as evidence. So I think that it really does, serve its purpose. But I think it's time for us to start to take it to the next level for sure.
Okay, and what are some of the things that we can expect to see at that next level, or at least what are some of the intended reforms that could make the difference?
Mm-hmm. So I'm not quite sure if your listeners are aware of this, but when the funding for body-worn cameras was first started by the Department of Justice, it actually only funded larger departments who could afford it. So think about New York, think about California, think about Boston. But the fact of the matter is that over 80% of police departments that are operating within the United States are small departments that don't really get that funding or have the funds in order to, have the latest technology of the body-worn camera characteristics that are necessary. So what we're seeing are body-worn cameras that are, varying in characteristics, whether it's their battery life, whether they can capture better quality videos, whether it's dark or light out. So I think that there really should be more proposed statewide policies as well as federal regulations when it comes to manufacturing. I think that all manufacturers should, be the same when it comes to body-worn cameras to a certain extent. I know that's, a huge ask, where that's capitalism, right? To say, hey, can we all start at the same level? But there definitely should be some type of, policies around, at least ground level, what a body-worn camera should be able to provide. So that's definitely, one thing that we can look into. Another thing would be, taking and looking at the actual data. Again, police departments are busy, and as we're seeing right now, that they're actually, only reviewing less than 1% of body-worn camera footage. Now, that's an issue because really, you're missing the meat of the data. And when I say you're missing the meat of the data, is that the whole purpose of body-worn cameras is not only, making accountability and transparency to the forefront for police officers, but it can also act as a preventative measure for excessive force to occur in the future, or police brutality, if you will. So, being able to look at that body-worn camera footage is very important. I think by doing so, it could definitely catch officers in the act before things get out of hand, before that they're still out on the street, and are an endangerment to the community. So with that being said, there is this new AI technology out called Trulio, which takes body-worn cameras and then it flags officers' behaviors, whether that's, something that is wonderful, it's great, they're speaking, with respect and, getting their jobs done. They will get a green check mark. But however, if they're, using that aggressive behavior, of words against someone who is stopped or interacting with them, then they get a negative point. And so that report is sent to leadership, monthly or weekly basis. So I think that's really important because it really can bring the police to the forefront, who are the true problem.
Okay, and you mentioned in your article about sometimes police will use selective recording. If an officer turns off his or her body camera, is that necessarily a red flag, or is that just not a well-advised thing to do because it raises questions?
It's definitely that's right. It's definitely a red flag to me. But policies differ, from states. Sometimes if you ask an officer to turn their body-worn cameras off in a particular state, they can tell you no. If you ask a body-worn officer to turn it on because you feel more comfortable, because you want to capture this footage, they can also tell you no. That's a huge deal. But with Trulio, I think would be awesome because you're having your officers flagged. Well, if you have an officer that's not having a report sent back for any type of flags, whether good or bad, that means that they're selectively recording incidents, and that's not okay. So it really does place us forefront, again, officers who may be using selective recording.
Okay. Well, I think at the end of the day, at least I want to believe, we're all on the same page from the standpoint of we want police officers who can provide a measure of safety and security for our communities. We want them to be tough enough to get the job done, but not tougher than that, to the point that that spills over into unwanted aggression or brutal behavior. Are there any reforms we got about 30 seconds here. Are there any reforms, in the works that continue to weed out a more aggressive mentality among officers, or is that just kind of something required for the job?
It's a really good question. They do have a tough job, but as of right now, no. We're still struggling to figure out a way how to improve, police officer encounters with everyday individuals. So we're still getting there, but it's definitely not fast enough.
All right. I appreciate getting to visit with you once again. We're talking with Finesse Moreno-Rivera. She is a Young Voices contributor. And Finesse, for people who want to follow your work, where is the best place to find you?
Of course, at Finesse Moreno-Rivera on Twitter, as well as at Finesse Moreno-Rivera on LinkedIn.
Very good. Thank you so much. I hope we talk again soon.
Thanks, Brian.